Hello and welcome to another edition of News for English Learners. As usual, we'll be looking at an article taken from recent news, going over it together and looking at the interesting words that we find. This week's article is entitled Revolutionizing Plastic Recycling, and it's about a really important discovery that could potentially solve one of the big problems of the modern world: how to get rid of all of that plastic waste that we all produce. So, without further ado, let's begin with the first paragraph. Plastic is everywhere, from water bottles to packaging, making it a part of our daily lives. But most of it ends up in landfills or the oceans, where it can harm wildlife and the environment. Only a small portion gets recycled, often not into top-notch products. But what if there was a way to break down plastic waste into its original building blocks and use them to craft new plastic products of the same quality? That is the promise of enzymatic recycling. Enzymes, biological catalysts that accelerate chemical reactions without being consumed, are the game changers here. They're produced by living organisms like bacteria and fungi to perform various tasks. So let's begin by looking at the first word here. This is a phrasal verb, to end up, and it's non-separable. And basically it is used when we talk about the finality of something, the end of a process, a period of waiting perhaps. Perhaps you have been waiting for the bus for a long time, and you think it's not coming, or maybe you're in a hurry, so you end up calling a taxi and using that instead. Maybe you go out with friends for an evening and you go to a restaurant and perhaps then you go to a bar, but you end up going to a nightclub or a disco. So you finish the night by attending the disco. In this particular case, in this context, what we're talking about is the ultimate destination of the rubbish, the plastic waste that we throw away. Now, it is supposed to be recycled or disposed of carefully, but unfortunately, a lot of it ends up in the oceans or in the wider environment. That is its ultimate destination. So let's move on to the next word here. We have this adjective phrase, top-notch. If we describe something as being top-notch, it means it's very high quality, perhaps the best that you can buy. It's a curious phrase, and I've tried to find out where it comes from, but unfortunately, there is no known origin for this phrase. It began being used sometime in the 19th century, but nobody knows why we particularly use these words to describe things of a high quality. A notch in itself is basically a U or V-shaped cut or indentation in another object. Probably the easiest way to think of it is, if you know anything about woodwork or how furniture is made, quite often pieces of wood are joined together by making cuts in them. If you make two cuts in two different pieces of wood, you can slot them together, and that creates a very strong joint. So those slots or cuts could be called notches. Equally, if you're going to cut down a tree, you usually can use a tool like a chainsaw, but sometimes people use axes. And when you use an axe, you have to cut a V-shape incision into the trunk of the tree in order to make it fall down. That also could be described as a notch. So don't forget, something that is top-notch is the best. In this case, what it's talking about is the problem of recycling we have at the moment. In fact, it's not really recycling what is done right now. It's more accurately described as downcycling, because in the current processes, when you change or you process plastic bottles or other types of plastic and you create something new out of that, that new product will be of an inferior quality because the processing itself is not perfect. It will degrade the material. And ultimately, again, once you've used that second product, it will also end up in landfill or in the ocean. Now, real recycling is a continuous circular process. You can use that material to make something of equal quality. And once that object has been used, you can again use it to make another object, and the process goes on and on. So that is the ideal version of recycling. And at the moment, that is not possible. When we use plastic, recycled plastic to make something, those products are not high quality. They're not top notch. So moving on to the next phrase. This is another phrasal verb here, break down, to break down. Now, this one does have a couple of different uses. Probably the more common use is when a machine or mechanical device stops working. We can say that it has broken down. It's very commonly used to describe the situation where your car stops working. So you could say, I broke down on the motorway and I had to call the rescue truck, the tow truck. Perhaps the elevator in your apartment breaks down and you have to take the stairs. So those are very common ways in which we use this as a phrasal verb. It can also be used to describe an emotional breakdown when somebody goes through a particularly traumatic experience in their life. Sometimes they go to pieces, as we say, they break down and they cannot cope with the things that are going on in their life. However, in this case, to break something down refers to a chemical way of decomposing a material into its constituent components. So the idea is that we can break down this waste plastic material into its chemical elements, and therefore we can use those to create or to craft new products that are of equal quality as the original. And therefore we would have real recycling. So to break something down in this way is to decompose it. If you imagine using detergent to break down oil, like if you've ever washed oily dishes or oily pans, greasy pans, if you use detergent, the detergent actually breaks down the molecules of fat and make it easier to wash. So moving on to the next phrase here, we have game changer. So this is a noun, two-part noun. It's actually a compound word. When we say something is a game changer, we're referring to something that is radically different, that is going to change the world in some way. It's going to change, in this case, the way that we recycle completely and hopefully improve it. So it is often used in the context of technological advances or inventions. If we think of mobile telephone technology, mobiles existed for quite a long time before smartphones came along, but it was really Apple's development of the touchscreen technology that was a real game changer. That led to the rapid development of the smartphone after the original Apple phone was released. And of course, there could be many other examples from the technological world. But the take-home point here is that a game changer is a dramatic and important development or change. Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph. Enter enzymatic recycling, where enzymes initially produced by bacteria break down plastics. Recently, researchers have looked into how these enzymes operate and are figuring out ways to incorporate them into commercial recycling programs. A standout enzyme is PETase, unearthed in a Japanese leaf compost heap in 2016. This enzyme can break down PET into its two monomers, ethylene glycol and terephthalic acid, which can then be purified and remade into new PET. In 2018, UK and US scientists stumbled upon a mutant PETase that was 20% more efficient than the original. They also found PETase worked better when paired with another enzyme, metase, which breaks down a PET byproduct. So, turning to the first word, we have another phrasal verb here, to figure out. This is actually a separable phrasal verb, so you can figure it out or figure something out. This is actually very similar to another phrasal verb which I've looked at in the previous video, to work out, because both of them can be used when you're talking about finding solutions to problems. In this case, the scientists are figuring out new ways, novel ways to incorporate the enzymes into the commercial recycling program. So they're still in the process of solving the potential problems that may exist in that process. If you think of a puzzle, like a crossword puzzle or Sudoku, you have to figure out the solution to those puzzles, right? So we can use it in all of those cases when you have a problem and you have to try to think of ways of solving it. Okay, moving on to the next word, we have standout. In this case, it is used as an adjective, but you will sometimes see this used as a phrasal verb. Obviously, as a phrasal verb, the two words would be separate. So to stand out from the crowd means that you are in some way different from the rest of the people. Now, if you've ever applied for a job, you'll know it's very important and actually quite difficult to stand out from the crowd. So in other words, it's quite hard to emphasize the ways in which you are different from the rest, why you should get the job as opposed to all the other hundreds or thousands of people who have applied. So anything that stands out is kind of highlighted, if you like. It is obvious. It is in some way different from the rest. And in this case, has the same idea, although it's used as an adjective. The standout enzyme is PETase. It stands out from the rest of the enzymes because it's particularly good at decomposing PET plastic. Now, this enzyme was actually discovered or unearthed in a leaf compost heap. So that brings us to the next word, heap. What is a heap? Well, it's a noun, and it's essentially a pile of things. So lots of objects piled on top of each other would make a heap. In this case, we're talking about a compost heap. So a compost is lots of organic material like leaves or branches or plants, or perhaps food waste that you pile on top of each other into a big heap, and you let it decompose, and that makes soil that can be used in the garden. In this case, of course, that leaves were piled on top of each other and they began to decompose, and that is where the Japanese researchers discovered this enzyme, PETase. You can also talk about a heap of clothes. If somebody is very untidy, they might just throw their clothes on the floor in a heap. We also use heap perhaps if you're talking about waste. Some industrial processes produce heaps of waste, particularly extracting various mineral ores or mining minerals. They produce waste, and usually that waste is just left in a big heap next to the mine. Moving on to the next word, we have this verb, to stumble. You can see that it's often used with the following word, upon. So when you stumble upon something, it's used slightly idiomatically, because the literal meaning of to stumble is very similar to trip, which is a word, a phrase that I have looked at in another video. To fall over, for example, when you fall over, it's often because you have stumbled. You've hit something with your foot and you have lost your balance and fallen on the floor. So literally to stumble is that, to trip, to almost fall, to lose your balance. But in this case, it's used, as I said, idiomatically. So in this case, it means that they accidentally found something that they were not originally looking for. Now, this happens a lot in science. One of the most famous cases would be the discovery of penicillin. which was discovered by Alexander Fleming. Now, he was not necessarily looking for antibacterials, but he stumbled upon them when he left out his Petri dishes one night. And then when he came back in the morning, he noticed that some of the mold that was growing on them had antibacterial, or appeared to have antibacterial properties. So he stumbled upon this important discovery. He was not looking for it. It happened by circumstance, by accident. And in this case, this was another case of a fortunate discovery, discovering a mutant version of PETase that was 20% more efficient. So let's move on to the final paragraph. Professor John McGeechan from the University of Portsmouth in the UK envisions using the super enzyme for recycling within a year or two. It's early days, but we're getting some good results. While enzymatic recycling offers advantages, producing high-quality recycled plastic and reducing emissions and energy use, it faces challenges. The need for large amounts of expensive enzymes, scaling up, and integrating with waste management systems are hurdles. Moreover, it doesn't tackle the core issue of plastic consumption and disposal. As Dr. Ramos from Roskilde University pointed out, enzymatic recycling is not a magic bullet. We still need to cut down on plastic use, enhance waste collection and sorting, and develop other types of biodegradable plastics. So in this paragraph, we have three words. The first one is hurdle. And in this case, a hurdle is a noun. And this, probably the easiest way to imagine what this means is to think of athletics, because in many modern day athletic competitions, there is an event called hurdles. And in the hurdles, I think it's usually 200 meters, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But in this kind of race, the contestants, the competitors have to race over a certain distance. But as well as running, they also have to jump over obstacles, which are called hurdles. And so we use this word, in this case idiomatically, metaphorically, to describe problems or issues that have to be overcome. They are hurdles. In this case, the hurdles are all of the issues that are outlined in the sentence. Because the enzyme is expensive to produce, it's difficult to scale up, and it's hard to integrate this new technology with existing systems. So those are all problems that have to be solved. They are hurdles that have to be overcome. So the next word we have here is the noun core. And this is a noun that can refer to a physical thing. For example, when you eat an apple, usually we eat the bit around the core, so the central part with the seeds in, that is called the core. Often we just throw that away. Other objects which have cores could be, for example, the earth. If you've ever seen a scientific model of the earth, you know there are different parts to it. There's the crust upon which we live. There's the mantle, which is fluid or semi-fluid. And there's the core, which is largely composed of iron and other metals. You will also see the word core used in computing. If you've ever bought a CPU or a modern computer, you will usually see the number of cores listed. The more cores, the faster the CPU is, the better it is at processing. Cores in computing are basically like mini CPUs in the center of the big CPU. So there we have it. The core issue is basically the central issue or the most important issue. In this case, it's used metaphorically, of course. We're not talking about a physical thing here. So the core issue, the most important issue, is the fact that this enzyme, although it's a good development, does not solve the issue of our overconsumption of plastic and the problem of what to do with it. Where do we dispose it? So moving on to the last phrase here, we have a magic bullet. And this is a curious phrase but it is used quite frequently when we're talking about solutions to problems. It's often used in the negative. When we say something is not a magic bullet, it essentially means it's not a perfect solution. It's part of the solution, but it's not going to solve the whole issue, as if by magic. I think originally this phrase came from medicine. I believe that it was back at the beginning of the 20th century when antibiotics were being developed and a lot of research was going into them, that a scientist came up with this phrase. I think he was a German scientist, and he translated it from the German, literally. And the idea of that in medicine was that you could develop an antibiotic or some other medicine that could target specific microbes within the body that would hit those microbes without doing any damage to the surrounding tissue. So it's almost like a magic bullet that you fire it and it goes straight to the target, missing any other people or objects around it. Now, nowadays it's used more broadly. It's not really used so much to talk about medicines. It's basically used to talk about any potential solution to any problem. And as I said, it's most commonly seen, I think, as a negative. You say something is not a magic bullet. It's not a panacea. It's not a perfect solution. So there we have it. We've reached the end of today's article. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you have learned some new vocabulary with me. If you have, then check out some of my other videos, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date.